This morning's Bible reading will be 1 Timothy chapter 3, 1 through 7. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. This is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and with the snare of the devil.
Thank you, Caleb, for reading that passage for us. That is the passage we're going to be at for our study this morning. If you want to find it in your Bibles, that's 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. It's good to see all of you here this morning. Got some visitors with us, and we want to thank you especially for being here. If you have the opportunity, there should be a visitor's card in front of you on the pew, a green card. If you want to fill that out, it would greatly help us, and you can hand it to one of our members here, or we will be happy to and glad to have a record of your attendance. I wanted to, before I get started with the lesson, we had a young adult event the other night, and we did some card writing, and the Taylors were there, Emily and Sam and Camden. And Camden wrote his thank you card to the whole church. So I thought, well, I'm going to read it to the whole church, right? So Camden said, to the church, thank you for helping us learn about God. And I said, well, that's very sweet and precious. And I wanted to read it to all of you here. And, we do have a responsibility to our young people, but also to all each other to help each other learn about God. And so thank you, Camden, for that card. I just wanted to read it to all of you before I get started with the lesson. We're talking about the office of overseer this morning. And, I heard one of our overseers this morning tell somebody else they could sleep during the sermon. And so I'm going to totally change my lesson on elders this morning now. No, I'm just playing. I'm just playing. I'm not going to do that. I do want to say, the first thing I want to say is that I'm very thankful that when it comes to the organization and the leadership of the church, that God did not leave it up to man to just figure out or to guess how that ought to go. I mean, if you did, can you imagine the type of things that we as men might come up with? We might decide, well, why don't we just put this one man or woman in charge of the entire congregation? That might be an option that we choose. Or perhaps we would invent some type of board or committee or convention and say, we're going to put them in charge of all the congregations in the world, or maybe at least all the congregations in a given nation or area. Or, if it was up to man, we might decide, I think a good idea would be if we would, pick out one man in the world and we will make him leader of the worldwide church. Almost as if he is an image of Christ himself on earth. We would probably do some very crazy things if God left it in the hands of man. And how do I know that man would do some of those things? Because man has done some of those things contrary to the will of God. You see, God did not leave it up to man to decide how the church should be organized, how authority and leadership should go in the church. He gave us very clear instructions. We are told in Colossians chapter 1, verse 18, that Christ is the head of the church, which is, of course, his body. And so he is at the top. There is no authority in the church above the authority of Christ. All authority in heaven and earth is given to him, including the authority in the church. We're also told that under the head of Christ that we are to have overseers or elders According to Titus chapter 1, elders are to be appointed in every church. And then, of course, the elders will appoint deacons who are there to serve the congregation as well. But that is the way that God has laid out in His Word that the church is to be organized. But God doesn't just give us those instructions. He doesn't just say this is the organization of leadership in the church. He also tells us a little bit about the task of being an overseer, and He even gives us instruction as to who should be allowed to fill that role of an elder or an overseer. Well, what sort of person should be allowed to do that? And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit this morning. We've been going through 1 Timothy. I know we've kind of left it and came back to it, and that's just the way that things have failed lately. But we're back in 1 Timothy again today. We're at chapter 3, and verses 1 through 7 cover elders, and specifically the qualifications of elders. And so we're going to talk about that and think about the office of overseer this morning. Now, as we think about the office of overseer in this passage, I've got two main points, but really we're going to focus more on the second point because we've got several subpoints in it. So very quickly, let's touch on the first one. First thing I think it's very important for us to notice in this passage is that when it comes to the office of overseer, overseers have a noble task. This is verse 1 of the passage. I hope you're there. Paul writes there to Timothy, the saying is trustworthy. Now, I want us to notice there that what Paul is about to write, apparently, I don't think Paul is saying, I'm inventing this saying. I think, in fact, and most scholars would tend to lean this way, that Paul is actually quoting something here that is a common saying in the first century church, and that they have developed this, and it's kind of spread around. It's almost become a proverb of sorts, a common saying. And the saying that he's talking about is, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. And Paul says this saying is actually, it's trustworthy. You need to pay attention to the logic that is being laid out in this saying. Notice also that he says, if one aspires to this office. He also uses the word desires for the office. That word aspire and desire as well, they present the idea of one who strives for, and especially the word for aspire, it even presents one who exerts energy in an effort to achieve or to gain something. And so he is actually talking about if someone would want to do that, if they would want to be intentional about aspiring to the office of an overseer. And I think it's important for us to think about that for just a minute, because I will say that the church, our church, but the church in general, the church needs men who aspire to the office of overseer. It's a great need in the church. The church needs men who are striving to meet the qualifications that are laid out in God's Word here in 1 Timothy 3 and also in Titus chapter 1. The church needs people who want to care for the souls in God's flock, who love God's people enough to be willing to take on that task. We need people like that. Have you ever heard people talk about how challenging the work of an elder can be, which of course it can, and I don't want to downplay that. But sometimes I hear it talked about so negatively that it's almost like, well, I would not want to take on that responsibility. I've heard preachers say, I'd rather be a preacher than I would an elder. And there are times I've thought that myself as well. I want to notice for just a second that Paul does not say to Timothy that whoever aspires to the office of overseer desires a burdensome task. He doesn't say they desire a wearisome task. Nor does he say they desire an impossible task. What does he say? Desires a noble task. That word for noble there in the Greek, it also means good and beautiful. That is, it's a good work, the work that elders do. It's a beautiful work that overseers do. It's something that we need men who aspire to that office, and it's a blessing to have men who are willing to fill that role. I appreciate all the men who take on that responsibility. I appreciate Ed and Sean, our elders here, who have been willing to take on that task, and as well as others who have served in that role in the past. I'm thinking of Lyndall in particular. It's a big job, it is, but it's also a noble task, and it's a beautiful task. So that's the first thing I wanted us to notice. Overseers have that noble task. But the second one, and the one that is more prominent in chapter 3, is the fact that overseers must be qualified. Because you can't just take anybody and put them in the office of overseer. We don't have the authority as a church to look around and be like, so-and-so, I just think they're a good leader. We'll just stick them in to the position of elder. We don't have that authority. God has given us a specific list of qualifications that an overseer must fit in order to be present in the office. You also find this list, a very similar list, in Titus chapter 1. We're going to stick mostly in 1 Timothy 3 this morning for the sake of our lesson, but we will probably reference Titus at least once or twice as we go through this. So if you kind of want to put a marker in there, that might be beneficial for you. There are a lot of qualifications that are listed, several, that are laid out in the chapter. I have grouped them into three major categories, and you can agree or disagree with them as you wish, but I think they're somewhat fitting. So there are three major categories for the sake of our lesson that we're going to say elders must meet the qualifications in these categories if they're going to serve as an elder. And the first one is that they must be qualified in family. And we see this in verse 2. We also see this in verses 4 through 5 in the chapter. So for verse 2, it says that an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. So what we find there, first of all, is that an elder must be a husband. Now, let's use a little bit of logic here. I think it's time that we point out that if an elder must be a husband, an elder must also be a man. Right? If you're going to be a husband, you have to be a man, right? Notice that all the language that is present in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus 1 is directed specifically to the male gender. Right? And the words that are used, like for the word for husband, is actually the word in Greek that just means men. It's the same word for man and for husband in Greek. There's one word that means mankind. There's another word that means man as in males. And that's the word that we have present here in 1 Timothy chapter 3. In fact, this can very literally be translated not just the husband of one wife, but the man of one woman. And that is what is being said here in this passage. Of course, this lines up with what Paul has already established for us in chapter 2. If you go back up in chapter 2 of 1 Timothy, in verse 12, what did he write? He said, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Well, if a woman falls in line with what Paul has written there in 1 Timothy 2:12, she can't possibly serve in the position of an elder. So what Paul is writing in chapter 3 agrees with what he has presented by inspiration of the Holy Spirit in verse 12. So I think a lot of us may have understood that, but of course, considering the culture that we live in, I think it's important for us to establish, no matter what our society says, the Bible says that an elder needs to be qualified in family, but that also means he needs to be a man, because he has to be a husband. Now, there's been a lot made about what does it mean that an elder must be the husband of one wife? Right? There are a lot of questions when it comes to that. Does it, if a man, he's married and his wife passes and he becomes a widower, is he still qualified to stay in the role of an elder? Or if his wife passes and he remarries, he's had 2 scriptural marriages, can he still be an elder? And so I'm not going to dive into all that necessarily this morning. I'll tell you my opinion on that. My belief is that in either of those cases, that man could still serve as an elder. I think he is qualified. Because I think the gist of what is meant by this phrase is what is literally said, which in the Greek, which is that he is a man of one woman, which you might easily take to mean he is a one-woman type of man. So what we can be very clear about, no matter how you stand on that, is that, first of all, that women are not qualified to fill this position, but also men who have chosen to never marry, chosen to remain single, they are also disqualified from the position of an elder, because you have to have either be a husband or have been a husband scripturally in the past. We'll get to the why in just a second, but it's important to note that before we move to verse 4. Now, in verse 4, it says that he must manage his own household well. And then, what this means is going to be laid out as we continue in the text. Okay, he must manage his household. By the way, if you are a Christian man, I would just present to you the fact that you have been given management position, right? When it comes to your household, God has put you in the slot of manager, right? And that doesn't mean you are some type of dictatorial ruler in the household, but you have a responsibility that has been given to you by God. Now it says he must manage his household well, and then it continues and says that he must do so with all dignity. That is, he's a respectable, dignified leader of the home. This is a man who would be respected by his wife and kids. You know, there's a difference, I believe, between a father who is obeyed by his children because, yes, they fear him to a certain extent, right? But they also love and respect him. And a father who the only time the children are obey is because that they fear him to the point where they know that when the father loses his temper and gets out of control, he can be very harmful or painful, maybe even abusive, right? You could possibly get obedience strictly out of that type of fear. But that's not the type of father that the Bible teaches. It's not what we are looking for in the qualifications of an elder. We're looking at a man who rules the home, who manages the home with dignity. He's respected by his wife and children. He goes on to say that his children are submissive. Well, I think that implies that they are obedient to him as their father. And in fact, if we go over to Titus 1, here's a helpful place to look over there. Titus chapter 1, verse 6, we read there, if anyone is above reproach, of course this is still talking about elder qualifications, the husband of one wife and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Right? So what does it mean that his children are submissive in chapter 3? Well, if we include Titus 1, we find, well, it means that they are believers, right? They're Christians. It also means that they are not known to be people, not known to be children who are insubordinate, who are just blatantly impossible to control, unwilling to follow authority of their father and probably therefore the authority of God and others. And so this is the qualifications that are laid out when it comes to the family qualifications for an overseer. A husband of one wife specifically, and that is a man who has been, had maybe multiple marriages before they became a Christian would not be qualified for that role. Or a man who is known to have been unfaithful in his marriage will not qualify for the position of an elder. A husband of one wife, a man of one woman. And also he must have children, and his children must be submissive, that is, they must be believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Now, we might ask this question, why does it matter? I know plenty of people who have been single who are very faithful members of the church, and I think probably hold leadership qualities to a certain extent. And so you might ask the question, why does it matter if a man has been married, if he has children, if he meets these qualifications? Well, it matters first of all because God has said that it matters, right? And so that we start at that point. But then God goes on to give us some more reasoning. We find out in verse 5, it says, for if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? In other words, the management of a man's house is a test case for how he would do in the managing the household of God. If a man cannot navigate challenges within the family, how will he navigate challenges that come up in the church. You know, to be a man who manages his household well, I would suspect that means that you have to learn to deal with conflict in some situations. It'll probably teach you how do I deal with misbehavior in the family, because children are going to misbehave. It teaches you, how do I deal with people with personalities who are different than my own, right? Because your spouse is going to be different in personality, and your children probably are going to be different in personality as well. All these things are things that you learn, and you have to learn in order to be a husband of one wife and to be a father who have children who are submissive. And that man has then proven himself. He has gone through the test case and learned skills that will help him in the leadership of a church. Now, that's the first set of qualifications, right? Overseers need to be qualified. We get that. The first major category is they must be qualified in family. I think, at least in my experience in the church, we spend a lot of time talking about the family qualifications and maybe not as much time talking about the other ones. And so we're going to do that this morning, make sure we get everything that is touched on in 1 Timothy 3. Overseers must also be qualified in character. In character. See this in verses 2 and 3 and in verse 6. So we go to verse 2. We see first of all here that it says that an overseer must be above reproach. Some translations might use the word blameless right there. This is either the first qualification in the list, or it is an overarching qualification. And that is my personal belief on that. I think what Paul is implying here is that a man who is blameless, who is above reproach in this category, he will meet all the other qualifications that are then listed thereafter, whether it is what is happening in his family and the other character qualifications we will see. And so in general, if we ask the question, what type of character does a person need to have to be an overseer, I could just blanket basically say he needs to be a blameless man. He needs to be a man who is above reproach. We keep reading though, we get to, he needs to be above reproach, the husband of one wife, and then sober-minded, self-control, respectable. This is a man who is, we might say, put together to a certain extent. He is presented as being rational and stable. And those things, he's sober-minded, he's self-controlled, he is respectable. There's a certain dignity about him. You can see how this man might be considered to be above reproach. I think when we continue into verse 3, we will see that this is, again, a measured type of person. He is not given to actions that are on the extremes, and he's not given to actions that are publicly viewed as distasteful or maybe even sinful. Look at verse 3. It says, he's not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. And so he's not given to those type of excesses and extremes. He doesn't give in to those type of passions. That is, he's a controlled, measured, rational, respectable person. That's the type of character we are looking for when it comes to the character of elders. You can imagine how an elder who did not meet these qualifications could be a problem, right? We could go to all of these and think about them, but think about for a second if you had an elder who was quarrelsome. I think that might be a little bit of an issue in the church. An elder who was wanting to stir up strife, easily quarreling with the other elders or with members of a congregation. I think that would probably cause problems. Or what if you had an elder who was greedy, was a lover of money? Well, you might have to start asking questions about what was happening to the money that was coming in, being given to the Lord's church. You can see how all these would be issues, and that's just a couple of thoughts. You could go down a long list of that. And then verse 6 of the passage. Look at verse 6 with me. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Well, this pictures a man who has a major character flaw, and that character flaw is the flaw of pride, arrogance, right? He's conceited, he's puffed up. And he gets puffed up in this case because he is, let's say, given too much power too fast, right? I think we understand in different aspects, not just in the church, in some different areas, if people are given too much authority too fast sometimes, this could be a little bit of an issue. And so we're trying to prevent this with the qualification that he must not be a novice, must not be a recent convert. You know, in 3 John chapter 9, John mentions a man named Diotrephes. It says, I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. He's talking about the authority of the apostles there. There's a lot of people who believe, and we don't know for sure, I don't think, but there are a lot of people who believe that Diotrephes might have been an elder in the church that John is writing to here. An elder who is unwilling to acknowledge the authority of others like the apostles and who likes to put himself first. Doesn't that kind of say to you someone who is puffed up, prideful, or arrogant? I don't know whether he was an elder or not, but the actions that he displays here would certainly contradict what an elder needs to be. And so he needs to be a mature believer, and hopefully by doing that, he will not fall into the same trap, by the way, the same condemnation of the devil. What happened to Satan? What caused the fall of Satan? It was really pride in the end, wasn't it? The desire to not be happy with the position that he had before God. And so that is the trap that an elder could fall into if he was a recent convert. And then, lastly, overseers must be qualified in reputation. So family, character, reputation. Verse 2. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach. That idea of being above reproach or blameless. What does that mean? I think it is the type of person, the type of man who, they're not perfect. They make mistakes like anybody else and they sin. But when you look at them, you have a really hard time of pointing out a major flaw, right? Like, I can't look at this person and be like, well, I mean, he's a decent guy, but he really struggles in this category, right? You know, the type of person that when you talk about him in a group of people, no one really has anything bad to say about that person. I think that's what it meant by the idea of blameless or above reproach. Maybe the type of person that if someone did bring up, you know, I think so-and-so did such and such in the negative view, that you would be like, I don't know that that's true. You know, like they have such a high character, their reputation is so good with you that you would think, I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate. I might need to look into that. In verse 7 we read, that moreover he must be well thought of by outsiders, so they may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. As an elder needs to have not just a good reputation in the church, but also with outsiders. You know, if a person was an elder in the church and their co-workers thought that he was someone who's impossible to get along with, you think that would be a good thing? What do you think that would make them think about the church? And then if we take it a step further, if they say, you know, this guy, he's kind of hostile, and then they have a negative view about the elder, so they have a negative view about the church, they might even have a negative view about Christ, all because of the influence of that man. He needs to be well thought of by outsiders. That is, you know, if someone thinks negatively about a man because he stood for what's right, that's one thing. And I don't think that's what's being thought about here. But if you talk to the co-workers of this man and they say, he's quarrelsome, or he's not entirely honest, I question his integrity, well, then that is probably not the person that you want to be serving as an elder. His reputation has to be good so that his influence for the Lord and for the church can be good. In other words, it's like Jesus said in Matthew 5:16. Got the wrong verse up there. But Matthew 5:16, it says, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. An overseer needs to be the type of man that embodies that idea, that has a reputation where his light shines in the world, and glory goes to the Father. I believe that there is no higher office on this side of eternity than to be an elder in the Lord's church. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. One of our former presidents, James A. Garfield, agreed with that. In 1881, James A. Garfield, who was at the time an elder in the Church of Christ, he said, "I resign the highest office in the land to become the President of the United States." That's how highly he thought of the role. I agree with him. I don't think there is a higher office on this side of eternity. It's a big task. It has its challenges. And it calls for men of high character, of high reputation, men who have proven to be godly leaders in their home. The qualifications are maybe a little strenuous, but it's also a good task. It's a beautiful and a noble work to assist the Lord in shepherding His flock to eternity. I'm thankful for our elders, the work that they do here. Thankful for those who have served as elders, and I'm thankful for all good elders in the church. Church needs good elders. Church needs men who are aspiring to be good elders. Now, this has not been a sermon that naturally lends to an invitation necessarily, but I want to try and make a quick application for us all. The overarching idea behind the qualifications for an overseer, I believe, it's really just a life that we should all be striving to live. Whether you're a person who can ever qualify for an eldership or a person who ever will desire to be an elder, don't you want to be a godly leader in your family? I do. Don't you want to be a person of outstanding character? I think you should. And don't you want to be a person who has a positive reputation, not for your own glory, but so that you can influence people for the sake of the Lord? I want to be that type of person. That's the type of person that needs to be an elder, but really, that's the type of person we all need to want to be as those who follow Christ. And it might be the case this morning that you look at your life and you think, I don't know that I'm living up to the standard in these categories. I don't know that my influence has been what it needs to be in the community, in my home. I don't know that my character has met the standard laid out there in this passage. There's an opportunity for you to take steps in the right direction this morning. I think that would be very beneficial for you to do. We're not guaranteed any more time past this day. The Lord's invitation is always open, but we know we have this moment. If you need to respond to that invitation, if you need the prayers of the church, whatever we can do for you, why don't you come while we stand and while we sing.